Opening the center, white immediately stakes a claim and prepares for development, aiming to control vital squares. Developing the knight to its most natural outpost, this response immediately contests central influence and prepares for a flexible pawn structure. Developing the knight to f3 fortifies the center and prepares for kingside castling, aiming for a solid positional advantage. Challenging white's central grip immediately, c5 introduces dynamic pawn tension and opens diagonal lines for black's pieces. Asserting central influence, this advance immediately challenges black's pawn structure and opens diagonals. Accepting the gambit immediately simplifies the structure, potentially leading to sharper play. Reclaiming the pawn with the knight immediately contests central space and offers a clear path for knight development. Establishing pawn structure and preparing for piece development, black initiates a common response to this aggressive queen's pawn opening. Solidifying the center with pawn support, this prepares to develop the king's bishop and maintain a comfortable pawn structure. Developing the knight to c6 solidifies the pawn structure and prepares for pawn advances in the center. Safeguarding the king's approach while preparing for an assertive kingside presence, this bishop's quiet deployment elegantly bolsters the central pawn chain and hints at a future kingside fianchetto or direct kingside attack. This check forces white to address the immediate threat, potentially disrupting their planned development and allowing black to gain initiative. The bishop's placement creates interesting tactical possibilities on the queen side. Relocating the bishop to safety after the check establishes piece harmony and prepares for potential castling, subtly reinforcing the center while avoiding any immediate tactical skirmishes. Exposing that bishop to potential knight harassment on the queen side forces a decision, either to retreat or exchange, potentially creating a slightly loose pawn structure if it vacates the active diagonal prematurely. Retreating the knight to this square is an interesting strategic choice, aiming to gain breathing room and avoid immediate confrontation while eyeing the potentially vulnerable black bishop. The knight now prepares to leap to c5 or even a4, potentially disrupting black's queenside development and creating a subtle outpost. This maneuver might also be a prelude to castling kingside, solidifying white's king's safety before launching a more aggressive central or queenside initiative. Retreating the bishop to b6 consolidates its position after being bounced, aiming to eye the weak d4 pawn and prepare for potential pawn pushes or knight maneuvers. Solidifying central control and preparing to develop the remaining pieces, this move seeks to untangle white's pieces and prepare for a pawn push to gain space. It also indirectly pressures black's knight on b6, which might need to retreat, opening up lines for white's own rook or queen. Unleashing the center pawn injects immediate dynamism, challenging white's central space and potentially opening lines for black's pieces. This aggressive pawn push seizes initiative, forcing white to confront the central tension and reconsider their development plans, all while aiming to disrupt the harmonious pawn structure white has carefully constructed. Capturing the pawn opens a critical central file, immediately challenging black's queenside development and forcing a decision about piece placement. Black embraces the central tension, recapturing the pawn and opening lines for their pieces, particularly the queen's bishop. This pawn structure now offers a more open game, where piece activity and development will be paramount. The knight on f6 is no longer pinned and can potentially redeploy to an aggressive square, while the d5 pawn aims to secure a foothold in the center and challenge white's ambitious pawn setup. Unleashing a knight to create immediate pressure on the queen side, this aggressive thrust aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially exploit weaknesses around the b6 bishop and c7 square. White seeks to gain initiative by forcing black to react to the knight's unwelcome presence, possibly leading to exchanges that favor white's development or piece activity. The knight's new outpost on b5 might also serve as a springboard for further attacks or a way to control key squares, dictating the flow of the game. Safeguarding the king is paramount, and castling here tucks away your monarch behind a solid pawn shield, preparing for the middle game battle ahead while also bringing the rook into play. Castling here solidifies the king and prepares for future central action, a prudent consolidation after a period of maneuvering and pawn exchanges. The knight bravely surges into the center, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious development and seize valuable central space. This maneuver immediately creates dynamic tension, forcing white to confront the unwelcome guest. One might consider its impact on the queen side. Does it offer a future out for the bishop on b6 if it's pressured, or perhaps even a pawn sacrifice opportunity? The knight's presence here, though seemingly aggressive, also opens lines for black's other pieces, potentially leading to quicker castling coordination or a coordinated kingside assault. Its very boldness may invite tactical skirmishes, and black should be prepared for white's likely responses to maintain the initiative. Unleashing the rook onto the open file, white aims to pressure the weakened queenside pawns and potentially target black's king if it ever ventures into the center, a classic maneuver designed to exploit the positional concessions black has made. A daring foray into enemy territory, the queen now stares down white's castled king, potentially disrupting the harmony of white's pieces and creating immediate discomfort. A bold repositioning to eye the queenside and challenge black's aggressive queen, aiming to disrupt any immediate tactical threats and prepare for a more serene development while eyeing the d-file. The rook's relocation to the e-file is a prudent step, aiming to bolster the central pawn chain and prepare for potential breakthroughs. This repositioning cleverly eyes the d5 pawn and implicitly contests control of that crucial square. It sets the stage for a more robust defensive structure around the king, while simultaneously hinting at future offensive possibilities down the open file. Unveiling the central dark squares, white's bishop pivots to d4, a maneuver that both solidifies the queenside and casts a vigilant eye towards black's vulnerable king. The immediate threat isn't a direct attack, but a subtle pressure, aiming to restrict black's mobility and potentially orchestrate a future queenside expansion. Observe how this bishop's new post influences the interplay of forces. It's a strategic repositioning, not just a simple piece development, setting the stage for complex positional struggles. A daring exchange, offering white the bishop pair in exchange for potentially disrupting black's pawn structure and opening a pathway for the queen. Liberating the d4 square opens up a fascinating strategic crossroads, forcing black to confront the newly established knight's influence over crucial central squares. Asserting flank presence, this maneuver seeks to destabilize white's well-entrenched knight on b3 and simultaneously expand black's queenside influence, potentially opening avenues for future pawn pushes or piece redeployment. A bold repositioning to reclaim central influence and prepare for potential skirmishes on the queenside, aiming to disrupt black's burgeoning pawn structure. A bold gambit to disrupt white's harmonious development, forcing a critical decision regarding the control of the g-file and the potential for a knight outpost on f4. Unleashing the queen to f3 directly confronts black's daring queen sortie, creating immediate tactical crossfire and forcing a crucial decision about the queen's ultimate placement. A risky maneuver, this bishop venturing out, aiming to disrupt white's knight and queen coordination, but potentially exposing itself to immediate counterplay and leaving the kingside less defended. A bold declaration of intent on the kingside, this pawn push disrupts black's intricate attacking setup, forcing a strategic reassessment of the immediate threats and aspirations. Seizing the initiative, black snatches the pawn, but the queen's abrupt sortie to the kingside exposes it to immediate danger, potentially allowing white's pieces to swarm the vulnerable monarch while black's own army remains largely uncoordinated. Suddenly, the focus shifts to the exposed black queen. By activating the queen to this active square, white pressures the queen and simultaneously fortifies the kingside, preparing for potential pawn pushes and consolidating material advantage through positional gains. Initiating a bold counterattack, black throws a pawn forward to disrupt white's attacking coordination and exploit the exposed king, aiming to create chaos and potentially open lines. The immediate threat of the black queen is nullified, re-establishing a defensive screen around the white king and forcing a crucial repositioning of the enemy attacker. The queen's sacrifice on h2, while seemingly offering material, fundamentally alters the character of the game by immediately forcing a king's trek. Instead of a slow build-up, This move ushers in an immediate, sharp endgame with significant implications for central control and king safety, forcing white to navigate a landscape where their monarch's exposed position becomes a critical factor. The king's relocation to h2 now presents a stark vulnerability on the king side, a consequence of black's aggressive piece play and white's necessary pawn sacrifice. The open g-file, while seemingly under white's control, now acts as a direct conduit for potential future black attacks, especially if white cannot adequately reinforce the d-file or establish a solid defensive structure. This maneuver signifies a subtle but significant shift, moving from a sharp tactical battle to a more precarious positional defense where king safety becomes paramount. Black initiates a strategic reassessment by anchoring the rook on the d-file, a crucial artery for potential counterplay. This repositions the piece from its prior passive placement, now eyeing central influence and preparing for future file control should the opportunity arise. It signals a shift towards solidifying defensive structures and a cautious approach to the pawn structure's imbalances, demonstrating an understanding of piece activity in the post-queen exchange middle game. A decisive commitment to simplifying the position, even at the cost of momentarily exposing the kingside pawn structure, signals white's intent to gain an advantage in the upcoming endgame. Pushing the pawn now creates a pawn island on the queen side, potentially weakening the structure in the long run, though it does gain a step on the knight and forces a decision regarding the b-pawn. Shattering the isolated pawn structure opens aggressive lines, yet leaves the monarch exposed to potential checks. Black's capture, reclaiming material, dramatically alters the pawn structure, creating a doubled isolated pawn on the file for white, a clear structural weakness to target in the ensuing middle game or potential endgame. Clearing the diagonal for the rook and opening the file presents a tantalizing prospect for immediate initiative, yet it simultaneously exposes the queenside pawns to further pressure and sacrifices the pawn's structural integrity for a transient attack that may lack sufficient support. Asserting control over the now open file presents a primary objective, and repositioning the rook here aims to contest it, potentially creating future avenues for pressure or defense. Finally, consolidating the bishop's influence. The idea behind this repositioning is to bring the bishop back into the game, not as an attacking piece on the queen side, but to support the central pawn structure and potentially prepare for a rook lift or a more active central presence. Notice how black's knight on a5 is quite passive. This bishop move offers white a chance to slowly improve their piece coordination and prepare for future pawn breaks or to defend against black's limited counterplay. It's a subtle shift, aiming to improve white's positional standing by reactivating a somewhat sidelined piece. Consider how this bishop might later support a central pawn push or even defend the king if needed. Black seizes control of the crucial e4 square, disrupting white's pawn structure and creating an outpost for the knight should it find its way there. This advance prepares to contest the d-file and potentially initiate a queenside play. Reclaiming the bishop establishes a healthy pawn structure for white and activates the piece, posing immediate threats to black's uncastled king. Disrupting white's central pawn structure and opening up lines, this exchange aims to exploit the slightly misplaced bishop on d3 and potentially create weaknesses around white's king. Suddenly, the pawn structure irrevocably alters, opening a diagonal for white's bishop and creating an isolated pawn on d4, a strategic target that will demand vigilant defense for the foreseeable future, while simultaneously unlocking the queenside for potential pawn advances. A bold infiltration, the rook pierces white's defenses, aiming to disrupt the established pawn structure and create immediate tactical complications in the liberated central files. Liberating the bishop from its restrictive guard on the 7th rank, this move immediately injects life into white's pieces and aims to exploit the exposed black king, creating a direct confrontation on the now open files. Liberating the bishop from its cramped diagonal allows it to participate in the defense of the kingside, while simultaneously preparing to contest the d-file. Suddenly, the bishop shifts to its dark-squared sibling's former perch, creating a formidable battery aimed at the kingside, hinting at an aggressive push to exploit any lingering weaknesses around black's monarch. Reclaiming the pawn with the bishop dramatically alters the material balance, and opens up a cascade of tactical possibilities for black, potentially overwhelming white's weakened structure. Suddenly, the rook lunges to the third rank, aiming to dominate the central files and exert pressure on black's slightly exposed king. Recapturing the pawn on b3 immediately addresses the immediate threat of the rook on b3 and aims to consolidate black's material advantage after white's aggressive pawn sacrifice. The immediate tension around the d4 pawn is resolved, and black's pieces now start to coordinate more effectively, particularly the rook's potential to swing to other open files or even support an eventual pawn push. A decisive push is initiated as the rook anchors itself on the second rank, preparing to exploit the open file and potentially sever the connection between black's awkward bishop and its king. Challenging the rook's influence and aiming to disrupt white's already compromised pawn structure, this maneuver brings fresh energy to black's position by initiating contact with the c3 rook, potentially forcing it to retreat and opening a diagonal for the bishop. Bishops on a8 and c8 now eye the exposed white king. The rook anchors itself on the sixth rank, not just to defend the pawn on b6, but to create a potent battery with the queen on the g-file, simultaneously eyeing the vulnerable white king. This redeployment also prepares for potential future advances on the king side should white's pieces falter in their coordination. Unlocking the c8 bishop's diagonal creates a crucial threat against the vulnerable rook, forcing black to either defend it passively or accept a material loss. Focusing on reinforcing the king and preparing for a potential pawn storm on the king side, the black monarch now ventures to the seventh rank. Bishops now lock down opposing flanks, limiting mobility and setting the stage for a strategic pawn march. Pressing the now exposed dark squares around white's king, this aims to exploit the queenside material imbalance before white can consolidate. Centralizing the monarch offers a safer haven for the king, while preparing to support potential pawn advances on the king side. Unleashing the bishop from its passive defensive post on b7, black finally activates this piece, aiming to disrupt white's newly established battery on the c-file and potentially open lines for counterplay. Consolidating the rook on the open file, this maneuver aims to exert relentless pressure on black's somewhat exposed king and prepare a potential breakthrough in the center or on the queen side, forcing black into difficult defensive choices. Initiating a dramatic material exchange, black sacrifices a rook for a bishop, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially activate their own remaining pieces. This bold decision, while seemingly sacrificing material, could open up crucial lines for the black queen and dark-squared bishop, transforming a seemingly passive position into a more dynamic battleground. The key question is whether black can generate enough counterplay to justify the lost rook, or if white will consolidate their material advantage. The rook now forcefully occupies the seventh rank, an aggressive assertion that pressures the opponent's vulnerable pawns and disrupts their defensive structure. Reclaiming the initiative, black immediately targets the now exposed white bishop, aiming to simplify into an endgame where material parity might offer drawing chances. The recent exchange has stripped away much of the central pawn structure, leaving black's rooks isolated and vulnerable on their respective wings. This sequence decisively trades off material, aiming to simplify into an endgame where white can leverage their remaining connected passed pawns, particularly the kingside majority, for victory. The position now transitions into a clear advantage for white, who has better pawn structure and a more active rook. The king's exposure will become a critical factor in the coming moves, as white can now press the attack with renewed vigor. The initiative has firmly shifted to white, who can begin consolidating their gains and preparing to advance their decisive pawn majority. The king's valiant advance into the fray, seeking to support its beleaguered pawns, opens up a dangerous diagonal towards the enemy monarch. Reclaiming the central open file offers a chance to rearrange your forces and potentially exploit the slightly disconnected nature of black's rooks. Unlocking the kingside potential now becomes paramount for black, as advancing the h-pawn aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create attacking opportunities on that wing. Asserting control over the central files now becomes paramount, with the rook on c2 aiming to disrupt black's coordinated pieces and prepare for further encroachment.